A woman once spent nearly 6 years chasing a goal that most people would consider surprisingly small. The goal wasn't $1 million. It wasn't financial freedom. It wasn't early retirement. It wasn't even a 6-figure investment portfolio. Her goal was simply to save her first $10,000. For years, it felt impossible. Every time she made progress, life seemed to push her backward. A car repair erased months of savings. A medical bill appeared out of nowhere. Rent increased. Unexpected expenses showed up at exactly the wrong moment. No matter how hard she worked, her money seemed to disappear as quickly as it arrived. Then one day, she opened her banking app and saw a number she had never seen before. $10,000. Objectively, nothing about his life had changed overnight. He wasn't rich. He still had to work. He still had bills. He still had responsibilities. But something felt different. For the first time, he realized he wasn't just earning money anymore. He was building wealth. And that's an important distinction. Because most people spend their entire lives earning money without ever building wealth. At first, those two things sound identical. But they're not. Earning money is what you do today. Building wealth is what improves your future. And the reason the first $10,000 is so difficult is because it's the point where you stop living entirely in the present and start creating options for the future. The strange thing is that almost nobody talks about this milestone. Social media talks about becoming a millionaire. Financial influencers talk about investing. News headlines talk about billionaires. But very few people discuss the stage that comes before all of that. The stage where every dollar matters. The stage where progress feels painfully slow. The stage where your savings grow, mostly because of your effort, not because of investment returns. Yet this stage may be the most important phase of wealth building. Because if you can't reach your first $10,000, it's almost impossible to reach your first $100,000. And if you never reach your first $100,000, reaching financial independence becomes much harder. The first $10,000 isn't important because of the amount itself. It's important because of what it teaches you. To understand why, we need to understand how most people experience money. Most people believe their financial problems would disappear if they simply earned more. It's an understandable belief. After all, if you're struggling to pay bills, a larger paycheck seems like the obvious solution. And sometimes it is. But higher income alone doesn't guarantee wealth. If it did, every high-income earner would be wealthy. Yet that's clearly not the case. There are people earning modest incomes who quietly build significant wealth over time. And there are people earning 6 figures who remain trapped in financial stress year after year. The difference isn't always income. Often it's behavior. Behavioral finance researchers have spent decades studying how people make financial decisions. And one of the most powerful discoveries is that human beings naturally prioritize immediate rewards over future rewards. In other words, we're wired to think short-term. A new purchase today feels more exciting than an investment that may grow over the next 20 years. A vacation feels more rewarding than adding money to a retirement account. A luxury upgrade feels more satisfying than building an emergency fund. The problem is that wealth is built almost entirely through decisions whose rewards arrive later. That's why wealth building often feels uncomfortable. The benefits are delayed. The sacrifices are immediate. Imagine 2 friends who both receive a $5,000 bonus from work. The first person immediately upgrades their lifestyle. A nicer vacation, a new phone, more dining out, a few impulse purchases. Within months, the money is gone. The second person uses the bonus differently. Part goes into savings. Part goes into investments. Part strengthens their financial foundation. Years later, the difference becomes enormous. Not because one person earned more, but because one person converted income into assets. This is one of the biggest financial lessons you'll ever learn. Income creates opportunities. Assets create wealth. Most people focus on income. Wealthy people focus on assets. That's why the first $10,000 matters so much. It's often the first meaningful amount of money that begins working for you instead of disappearing from you. But before we talk about building wealth, we need to talk about the biggest obstacle standing in the way. And that obstacle isn't the economy. It isn't inflation. It isn't investing. It's something much closer. It's lifestyle inflation. Lifestyle inflation is one of the most dangerous financial traps because it feels like success. You get a raise, you celebrate. You move into a nicer apartment. You buy a newer car. You increase your spending. Everything feels justified because your income increased. The problem is that expenses often rise just as quickly as income. As a result, your lifestyle improves, but your wealth doesn't. Many people spend years chasing higher income only to discover they still feel financially stuck. Not because they aren't earning enough, because every increase in income creates an increase in spending. Imagine trying to climb a mountain while carrying a backpack that gets heavier every time you move upward. That's what lifestyle inflation feels like. The higher you climb, the more weight you're carrying. The first $10,000 usually requires breaking this cycle. It requires creating something that financial experts often call a wealth gap. The wealth gap is simple. It's the difference between what you earn and what you spend. Every dollar that remains in that gap can become an asset. Every dollar spent disappears from the wealth building process. This doesn't mean spending is bad. Money should improve your life. The goal isn't to become obsessed with saving every penny. The goal is to create enough distance between income and spending that wealth has room to grow. And this is where many people encounter an uncomfortable truth. Building wealth has less to do with looking rich and more to do with delaying the appearance of being rich. The world encourages visible success, nice cars, luxury brands, expensive experiences, but actual wealth is often invisible. You can't see someone's retirement account while they're walking down the street. You can't see their investment portfolio. You can't see the assets quietly generating future income. What you usually see is spending, and spending is often mistaken for wealth. This confusion causes countless people to make financial decisions that feel rewarding in the short term, but damaging in the long term. Because real wealth usually grows in silence. It grows while nobody is paying attention. It grows while other people are showing off purchases. It grows while financial discipline goes unnoticed. And that brings us back to the first $10,000. The reason it's so difficult is that you're doing almost all the work yourself. When your savings are small, investment returns don't matter very much. Let's say someone has $500 invested. Even a fantastic year in the market won't dramatically change their life. The growth is helpful, but it's small. At this stage, almost all progress comes from saving, from earning, from discipline, from consistency. You're the engine. You're creating nearly all the momentum. This is why the beginning feels slow, painfully slow. In fact, many people quit during this stage because they underestimate how long it takes to build financial momentum. They expect dramatic progress. Instead, they experience gradual progress. And gradual progress can feel invisible. Imagine planting a tree. For months, maybe even years, it appears as though very little is happening. But beneath the surface, roots are developing. The foundation is strengthening. The future growth is being prepared. Wealth works the same way. The early years often look unimpressive from the outside. But internally, something important is happening. You're building habits. You're building systems. You're building discipline. You're building financial confidence. And those things matter far more than people realize. Because eventually, money starts helping. Eventually, the process changes. Eventually, your savings become large enough that investment growth begins contributing in meaningful ways. And when that happens, the game becomes completely different. This is the moment most people never see coming. For years, building wealth feels like pushing a heavy boulder uphill. Every dollar requires effort. Every contribution comes from your paycheck. Every step forward feels earned. Then, slowly, almost invisibly, something changes. The boulder doesn't get lighter. You get stronger. Your habits improve. Your financial decisions become more intentional. And eventually, money starts doing some of the work alongside you. But before that happens, there is another challenge that catches many people off guard. The challenge is boredom. Most financial failures don't happen because people don't know what to do. They happen because the process feels too slow. Think about it. Saving money is rarely exciting. Building an emergency fund isn't exciting. Contributing to retirement accounts isn't exciting. Watching an investment portfolio grow gradually over many years isn't exciting. At least not compared to the endless stream of entertainment, consumption, and instant gratification available every day. Modern life is designed to reward speed. We can order food in minutes, watch movies instantly, purchase products with a single click, receive constant notifications and stimulation. But wealth operates on a completely different timeline. Wealth rewards patience, and patience has become one of the rarest financial advantages in the modern world. This is why many people abandon good financial plans. Not because the plans don't work, because the results take time. What most people fail to realize is that wealth creation often looks boring while it's happening. The exciting part comes later. The freedom comes later. The options come later. The security comes later. The beginning is usually quiet. And that's exactly why so many people underestimate its importance. Consider what happens when someone finally accumulates a few $1,000s in savings. The immediate financial impact might seem small, but the psychological impact is enormous. For the first time, an unexpected expense doesn't automatically create panic. A car repair becomes an inconvenience instead of a crisis. A temporary setback becomes manageable instead of devastating. This is one of the hidden benefits of reaching the first $10,000. It doesn't just improve your finances, it changes your relationship with money. Before savings, every financial problem feels urgent. After savings, many financial problems become manageable. That difference affects how you think, how you plan, how you make decisions, and ultimately how you build wealth. Researchers who study scarcity have found something fascinating. When people constantly worry about money, a significant portion of their mental energy becomes consumed by short-term concerns, bills, deadlines, immediate needs, financial emergencies. The brain becomes focused on survival. Long-term planning becomes harder. Strategic thinking becomes harder. Patience becomes harder. This isn't a character flaw. It's a human response to scarcity. But when savings begin to grow, some of that mental pressure starts to disappear. And with that relief comes something incredibly valuable. The ability to think beyond next week. The ability to think beyond next month. The ability to think about years instead of days. That shift alone can change someone's financial future. Because wealth isn't built through short-term thinking. It's built through long-term thinking repeated consistently. This is why the first $10,000 represents more than money. It represents proof. Proof that you're capable of creating a financial buffer. Proof that you're capable of delaying gratification. Proof that you're capable of building momentum. And momentum is one of the most powerful forces in personal finance. Most people think motivation creates success. But in reality, momentum often creates motivation. When someone saves their first $500, they become encouraged to save the next $500. When they reach $1,000, they start believing $5,000 is possible. When they reach $5,000, $10,000 begins to feel attainable. Every milestone reinforces the belief that progress is possible. And belief matters more than many people realize. Because wealth building is partly a mathematical challenge, but it's also a psychological challenge. People rarely stick with goals they don't believe they can achieve. That's why small wins matter. That's why early progress matters. That's why the first $10,000 matters. It's often the point where doubt starts losing its grip. But there is another important lesson hidden inside this milestone. And it's a lesson that many people don't fully appreciate until later. The first $10,000 teaches you that income and wealth are not the same thing. At first, this sounds obvious. Of course they're different. But many people unknowingly treat them as though they're identical. When income rises, spending rises. When bonuses arrive, purchases increase. When raises happen, lifestyles expand. The result is that wealth never has an opportunity to grow. The person becomes a high earner, but not necessarily a wealthy person. True wealth requires a different approach. It requires converting income into ownership. Ownership of investments. Ownership of businesses. Ownership of productive assets. Ownership is what separates temporary income from lasting wealth. Imagine two individuals earning exactly the same salary. One spends nearly everything they earn. The other consistently acquires assets. 10 years later, their financial lives may look completely different. Not because of income differences, because of ownership differences. One consumed their earnings. The other preserved a portion and allowed it to grow. This is where the real power of wealth building begins. Because eventually, assets start generating returns. Returns generate more assets. More assets generate more returns. And the cycle starts feeding itself. This process is often called compounding. Albert Einstein is frequently credited with calling compound interest one of the most powerful forces in the world. Whether or not he actually said those exact words, the principle remains true. Compounding can appear unimpressive in the beginning, then astonishing later. That's because compounding is not linear. It's exponential. The early stages feel slow. The later stages feel fast. And that's exactly why people underestimate it. Imagine placing a single grain of rice on a chessboard, then doubling it on every square. 1 grain, 2 grains, 4 grains, 8 grains. The first several squares seem insignificant, but eventually the numbers become enormous. Compounding behaves in a similar way. Progress looks small until suddenly it doesn't. And the first $10,000 is often the point where people begin to understand this concept emotionally, not just intellectually. Before reaching that milestone, compounding feels theoretical. After reaching it, compounding starts feeling real. You begin to see how small actions repeated consistently can create surprisingly large outcomes. That's one of the most valuable lessons wealth can teach. Most financial success doesn't come from dramatic decisions. It comes from ordinary decisions repeated over long periods of time. The problem is that ordinary decisions rarely attract attention. Nobody posts on social media about contributing to an index fund every month for 10 years. Nobody celebrates avoiding unnecessary purchases. Nobody gets applause for maintaining financial discipline. Yet those actions quietly create extraordinary results. The public often sees wealth at the finish line. They rarely see the years of consistency that created it. And consistency is what transforms financial goals into financial reality. This becomes especially important when discussing investing. Many beginners spend enormous amounts of time searching for the perfect investment, the perfect stock, the perfect strategy, the perfect opportunity. But during the journey to the first $10,000, investment selection is often less important than investment behavior. A good investment strategy consistently followed usually outperforms a perfect strategy that gets abandoned. Patience beats excitement. Consistency beats intensity. Time beats timing. Those principles may sound simple, but they have created more wealth than most complicated financial strategies ever will. And that's encouraging, because it means building wealth doesn't require genius. It requires discipline. It requires patience. It requires systems. And most importantly, it requires staying in the game long enough for the process to work. The people who build wealth aren't always the smartest. They're often the people who refuse to quit. The people who continue saving when progress feels slow. The people who continue investing during uncertainty. The people who continue thinking long-term while others focus only on the present. That's why the first $10,000 changes everything. Not because the number itself is extraordinary, but because the person who reaches it is no longer the same person who started the journey. So how do you actually reach your first $10,000? Not in theory, not in a motivational quote, in real life. The answer is surprisingly simple, even if it isn't always easy. First, you need to know where your money is going. Many people can tell you exactly how much they earn. Far fewer can tell you exactly how much they spend. And what you don't measure is difficult to improve. The goal isn't to obsess over every dollar. The goal is awareness, because awareness creates control, and control creates progress. The second step is creating a consistent gap between income and spending. This gap is where wealth is born. Every dollar that stays in this gap becomes a building block for your future. The larger the gap becomes, the faster wealth can grow. The third step is increasing your earning power. There is only so much you can cut, but there is often significant room to earn more. A new skill, a promotion, a side business, freelance work, professional certifications, career growth. These opportunities can dramatically accelerate the journey to $10,000. But there is one important rule. When income rises, don't allow spending to rise at the same speed, because that's how people stay stuck. Instead, direct part of every income increase toward building assets. That's how momentum begins. The fourth step is protecting your progress. Unexpected expenses are inevitable. Life happens. Cars break down. Medical bills appear. Jobs change. This is why emergency savings matter. Not because emergencies are predictable, but because they are guaranteed. Financial resilience is what keeps a temporary setback from becoming a permanent setback. And finally, once you reach your first meaningful savings milestone, begin putting your money to work. Invest in productive assets. Think long-term. Focus on consistency rather than perfection. Remember, wealth is rarely created through one brilliant decision. It's usually created through hundreds of good decisions repeated over time. And that's what makes the first $10,000 so important. It proves that you can do it. It proves that your financial future is not determined by your past mistakes. It proves that wealth is not reserved for people with extraordinary talent, extraordinary luck, or extraordinary incomes. It's built by ordinary people making better decisions consistently. That's the real lesson. The first $10,000 isn't valuable because of what it can buy. It's valuable because of what it teaches. It teaches patience. It teaches discipline. It teaches delayed gratification. It teaches ownership. Most importantly, it teaches that wealth is not an event. It's a process that often feels slow while you're living through it. But one day, you'll look back and realize those small decisions were never small at all. They were building the foundation of everything that came after. Because the truth is, the first $10,000 is hard for a reason. You're building the habits. You're building the systems. You're building the discipline. You're building the identity of someone who creates wealth instead of merely spending income. And once that identity exists, the journey changes. The next $10,000 becomes easier. the next milestone becomes clearer. Momentum begins working in your favor. And that's why so many successful investors and self-made millionaires remember their first $10,000 more vividly than much larger milestones. It wasn't the amount that mattered. It was what the amount represented. Proof. Proof that wealth was possible. Proof that the cycle could be broken. Proof that the future could be different from the past. And if there's one idea worth remembering from this entire discussion, it's this. Wealth doesn't begin when you become rich. Wealth begins the moment you stop living only for today and start building for tomorrow. The first $10,000 is hard because you're creating that future from scratch. But once you get there, you'll realize something powerful. The money wasn't the biggest achievement. The person you became along the way was